more important than the actual function. Does that make sense? In other words, it says I'm the emperor. That's what's really important. Whether it's a bowl or something else, and how that bowl was used is almost secondary to the fact that it shows that this guy was the emperor. And that's true from almost all areas. If you look at the buildings, and I hope you can see that arrow there, starting from the every part of the building would say that this is the home of the emperor, the son of heaven. So at the very, very top, we have these you'll see these. This is from Nanjing. See that marvelous dragon on there? That same kind of a snaky dragon that you find in the early part of the Ming. So this is a late 14th century dragon. But the whole thing is actually a fish dragon. It's been broken here, and this is the head of the fish, and this is the tail of the fish. And that's what appears on the top of almost all of these Ming buildings. As Dr. Hatcher was saying, the imperial color is yellow. So all of the tiles on the roofs, or a lot of the tiles on the roof, were yellow. So one of the first things Yongle did is he went through and changed the capital. It was the old Yuan capital. And one of the things that he went through and did is he was changing the Yuan capital, what was left of it, into the Ming capital, was change all the tiles. That's a lot of tiles. That was a huge, huge undertaking to change all those tiles. As you move down the buildings, you find, again, lots and lots of things that have symbolism, and they run down the ridges of the buildings, and so on and so forth. So you see these kinds of, again, kind of dragon-like creatures, mythical creatures, all kinds of animals that show power and control over the empire, that this is indeed the man who has the mandate of heaven. Right down to those ends, the very ends of the tiles where the water drips off of the roof. And everything else. So here we're looking at the newel posts that go around all of these marble, very extensive kind of marble platforms that are outside these buildings. Everything has symbolism. In this case, it's clouds and phoenix. So the phoenix being the symbol of yin and yang, the female, the empress, but also, again, a sign of divine right to rule. Boy, there was a lot of that marble. You know, this marble came from the Taihang Mountains, which is they're up in Hebei province. But even more interesting, as you look at the whole imperial enterprise, a lot of these big columns came from Sichuan province. So these are made of a wood called nanmu, and a nanmu that grows up in the mountains up above Sichuan. So in order to get those huge columns, these were entire logs that were sent. You know, they had to be floated all the way down the Yangtze River, all the way down to Nanjing. Up until 1415, when the Grand Canal was reopened, they had to be shipped all the way out to sea, by sea up to close to Tianjin, across land, and then to the palace. So the kind of labor, the kind of infrastructure that went into building this palace is quite remarkable. Where the tiles were made, where the various building materials were made, where the marble was quarried, and how the marble was worked. And then on top of that, everything is symbolic. In this case, again, these are just stones where the water coming from these terraces drips down. They take the form of dragons. So again, you have the symbol of the emperor and this divine right to rule, this fact that he has the mandate of heaven. So he's surrounded by all of these court officials of one sort or another. And here we have an image again from that same album, and we suspect that this gentleman is Mr. Xu coming in to receive some kind of an award. This gentleman is giving him his award, and that guy up there, that's the emperor. So he's sitting up there looking down on everybody else, and with his bright yellow backdrop again, yellow being the imperial color. When you look at these kinds of images like this, you have a very clear sense of rank, that everybody has a color, everybody has a badge, everything is ordered and assembled in a way that says this guy's at the top and the rest of these people are some way subordinate, and they're very, very carefully structured out. And color becomes something that's very important in delivering this message. Red was an important color for the emperor and for the Ming. The Ming family, ruling family's name was Zhu, which translates also as vermilion or red. So red was a color that they used a lot, so you see a lot of red in the buildings. It was also always had been a symbolic color. The direction is south, associated with the direction of south, and associated with good fortune. So you see a lot of red, but also you see these primary colors basically telling you as you walked in what the status was of everybody around you. So status was very carefully and clearly drawn out with the emperor right at the very, very top. Foreign affairs. This was important. Dr. Hatcher talked about the journeys of Zheng He and that massive fleet. Some 27,000 people went on some of those journeys. They're quite remarkable. So again, the emperor was the son of heaven and was ruling all under heaven. So having those symbols of this relationship of kind of receiving tribute from countries outside and giving gifts was an important part of this whole court structure. So the emperor would make these elaborate and rather wonderful gifts. They were presented to envoys who came to court. Envoys would bring tribute. They would pay tribute. The emperor was meant to be above commercial enterprise. So they weren't buying and selling. He was giving gifts and he was receiving tribute. And anybody would argue with that would probably be right because there was a lot of commercial going on, but that was the idea, that the emperor was receiving tribute and giving gifts. And that was a sign that he was the son of heaven and ruling all under heaven. This is a marvelous hand scroll. I don't know how many of you were able to come and see the Ming exhibition, but this was out in the Ming exhibition. And this is a painting by the later professional artist Chou Ying, active in the 16th century again, showing a whole series of different kind of very imaginary looks at what these foreign tribute bearers might have looked like. And there are paintings like this going all the way back to the Tang and always certainly through the Qing. Interestingly enough, there were also very closely observed portraits. This is a series of portraits of envoys to the Ming Dynasty. These again are probably somewhere in the early part of the 1500s. And these are remarkable because they're so closely observed, catching both the facial features but also the ethnic garb of these envoys to the Ming court. This was important, again, for the emperor to show that he had the right to rule, that he had this mandate of heaven to all peoples. And having these people come and visit was something that, again, showed to the people around him, to all of his subjects, that he did have the mandate of heaven. How many of you were here in 1997 when we did the Treasures of the Forbidden City, the Treasures of the National Palace Museum in Taiwan, that exhibition? So this scroll came at that time. I don't know how many of you remember seeing it. It's an imperial procession to the Ming tombs. It's unsigned and undated, but probably dates to the reign of the Jiajing emperor. So somewhere around 1550. It's about, for a hand scroll, it's really, really large. It's about a meter plus tall, and it's about 30 meters long. It's the biggest painting in the National Palace Museum in Taiwan. It's the longest, still recorded to be. And what it shows is a procession to the Ming tombs, and it's the emperor going on a procession to the Ming tombs. And it gives you a kind of an idea of what kind of material was used in these kind of ceremonies. By the time you get into the 1500s, there were ceremonies. The emperor was doing some kind of a ceremony, at least a major one, once a month, and probably minor ones and things in between every week. And those would go from taking care of the imperial tombs to the ceremonial first plowing of the earth at the beginning of the harvest season, of the planting season. All of those were very, very important, both to show that he had the mandate of heaven and also to maintain that mandate of heaven. So this is going to the Ming tombs. If this is to translate into modern terms, this is probably around the Qingming festival time, which that still is part of the Qingming festival. So somewhere early April, so kind of in the springtime, and there are indications that this is done about that time or represented, seen about that time. Cold food festival, so they didn't go out and prepared food. They carried all the food out. They carried all the things to eat the food. They went out and cleaned the tombs. They went out and did that whole kind of process, and that continues to modern times. And you'll get a sense as you go through this scroll that it is actually a spring scene. There's some flowering trees up there, and so on. But boy, there's just a lot of stuff. But they don't open up any of those carriages. I don't know what's inside of any of them, doggone it. They're quite beautiful, they're quite marvelous, but I want to know what's in there. Oh, but the door doesn't open, they don't tell me, so. And it goes on and on and on. We get a good look at the emperor. Kind of a boring looking guy, isn't he? Even though he's on his marvelous horse. What always strikes me as I look at images like this is just how much textile art was being created. I mean, there are just acres and acres and miles of beautiful silk textiles. Look at them. All of those garments, all of them with their imperial symbols or their symbols of rank of one sort or another, banners and on and on and on. The silk industry was incredibly large and incredibly well developed at this time. And again, was one of those things as we talk about globalization and the global economy, silk was moving in great amounts from China to the Americas at this time. There's been some interesting studies on by people working in Mexico about the number of people employed in the textile industry in Mexico, where raw silk was being shipped from China to Mexico, and then it was being into vestments and so on and so forth by those laborers in Mexico under Chinese supervision. So there was this whole kind of international trade going back and forth in silk, and then there were great manufacturers of silk in Nanjing, Hangzhou, Suzhou, and other areas. The main imperial production centers were Nanjing and Hangzhou and Suzhou. Wonder how those elephants felt about being in Beijing during the wintertime. I doubt that they were very happy, but certainly there were elephants and elephant-pulled carriages. And this gives us a little bit of an idea about some of the materials. Again, if you look closely, these guys down here are carrying some sort of ladder that must fit up there. These guys are carrying a chair with a yellow cover, so that must be for the emperor to sit on when he gets there. This marvelous, again, that yellow fabric that would have been yellow silk. This was probably a horseshoe-backed armchair in red lacquer, so that's something the emperor would have sat on. Look at all the dragons back here on these fabrics and all the marvelous fabrics. But again, they just don't open that up. I want to know what's going on inside. I want to know what's inside there. Then they get to the tombs, and they don't show any of the ceremonies going at the tombs. They just show the tombs. That's rather disappointing. Then they turn around and go back. And by the time they go back, I think the emperor's tired, and he's going back by boat. So there he is in his boat. And again, marvelous silks and fabrics and so on. We get a little idea of some of the things that were going on. Again, look at all these marvelous fabrics. I don't know who these guys are, other than the fact that they're musicians. Oops. Can you see their hats? They all have these tassels. They have these weird pointed hats with these tassels. I had no idea. That's very, very strange. I find that fascinating. And then these marvelous musical instruments, I bet it was noisy. Looks like it's mostly cymbals and drums and those kinds of noisemakers. So they're kind of making a noise as they're going back. Here we see some guys, and they finally opened one of those chests, and it looks like I think these guys have had too much to drink. And they're throwing things up in the air here. There's something being thrown up in the air, and these guys are getting a little crazy. And you see some vessels in here of some sort, but not enough to really tell you what it is. I think this is meant to indicate this is a nighttime scene, because I have to believe this guy is holding a candle, trying to guide the boat along. And then they have, again, all of these people and their marvelous fabrics going along in the back. Can everybody hear me? I've been walking away from the mic. Okay, all right? All right, good. And then they get back to the palace, and that's it. So it gives you kind of a general idea. If you think of this happening once a month, something like this happening once a month, can you imagine the amount of material that was being consumed for these rituals? Oftentimes, these kinds of objects were made for a one-time use only. And then there are all these other structures that were used for the various kinds of rites and that were taken on, ceremonies that were taken on. The Temple of Heaven that Dr. Hatcher mentioned, the Temple of Agriculture. If you go to the Temple of Heaven, it's been totally restored. That means rebuilt and redone, and it's kind of garish and very, very, very public. If you go to the Temple of Agriculture, it's a little off the beaten path, and you'll get a better idea of what a Ming Dynasty building actually looked like. But you can see, again, a lot of the same kind of components on the actual architecture itself. Pieces like this. This was a piece commissioned for the Empress. Actually, the Empress Dowager during the reign of the Wanli Emperor, made for her birthday, her 50th birthday, a one-time use. This is done in, this is embroidered, and if you ever have the opportunity to come see it when it's out, this is our piece. It's amazing. You know, you actually have to have a magnifying glass to see the knots. They're tiny little knots. The kind of labor that went into this was remarkable. This is the kind of piece that Therese Bartholomew would talk about at length, because at the top are the characters for long life. Then there are the 5-clawed dragons, which are the symbol of the emperor. The color is red, and it's the color of Jew, the family, and it's also the color of celebration, so for a birthday. The dragons are yellow. Actually, they're done in gold, so again, that's the imperial symbol. You have the mountains of the 4 directions on the bottom, with the li shui, the water, and treasures of one sort or another. All kinds of symbols here that tell you a full-on story about wishes of good fortune and long life, and so on. And that's, again, big part of what the court arts were about. But let's look at the portrait of one of these later emperors and talk about some of the object that we see there. So this is the portrait of Zhu Youjiao, the Tianqi reign, so 1621 to 1627, getting very close to the end of the dynasty. And this guy, he's almost vanished underneath those robes, hasn't he? And around him, all of these accoutrements, all these things, these symbolic things, he kind of vanishes into them. The weight of that long reign and the kind of all that goes with those rituals and symbols is beginning to overwhelm him, or has overwhelmed him. But we do get a pretty good idea, and we were lucky when we were working on the Ming Show to be able to pull out some things that actually related very directly to this portrait. This portrait actually wasn't shown here. We showed another one here. This one went to one of the other venues that we sent the show. But we chose it because it does give a very good idea, and we were able to find materials that actually came related directly to this portrait. So this is the kind of silk that would have been used for that kind of a robe. All the patterns are kind of cloud patterns. Again, the chi of the universe. That's the kind of woven patterns that's on the base garment, and then the marvelous embroidered dragons all around the top. So you get a good idea of how the actual object would have looked like. He would have worn a jade belt, and on that, so you see where the jade belt would be there. And we had in the exhibition this marvelous jade belt from the very beginning of the Ming. And again, that jade belt would have had dragons. This is some of the most gorgeous jade I've ever seen. It's absolutely pure white and just glorious. And the workmanship, those marvelous dragons and clouds and so on, just incredible. So again, this is the kind of thing that he would have worn, being a symbol of his right to rule. So if we look behind him, I suspect that's actually a fabric rather than a painting, probably an embroidery or maybe even a tapestry fabric. It has dragons on it, the symbols for long life. It has all kinds of things all the way around it. And if you look at the kinds of things that you often don't look at as you're looking at these paintings, there are things dangling all over the place. So things like this hanging off the back of it would likely have been gold and jade with symbolic decorations of one sort or another. Textiles again, and oftentimes objects were wrapped in textiles, and some of these elaborate and wonderful textiles. The Palace Museum has a marvelous collection of kind of just bits and pieces that have very rarely seen the light of day. So they have their original colors, like this one. And that's really, the textiles were just glorious. Cloisonné, like the piece there. So cloisonné was something that would have been, again, symbolic of the power and of the emperor. Ceramics, there's a nice little blue and white over there in the corner. So again, as you see these pieces, next time you come to our museum, which will be tomorrow, right? As you see these pieces, think of them in this context. It's not just, they're not just blue and white bowls and da-da-da-da-da. They actually were used in this way. You can imagine in your mind looking at this object and thinking, well, it might have been like that piece that I saw in the portrait of that Ming emperor. That kind of broadens out the perspective of how they were used, what they actually meant. And then again, these marvelous kinds of symbolic flowers, and flowers have all kinds of stories that go with them. They represent different kinds of things, and that's something that Therese is very, very good at talking about. Let's look also at a court woman, a lady of high rank, an aristocratic lady. Again, covered with symbolism of one sort or another, but also gives us a pretty good idea of some of the things that might have been worn at the time. And we were able to kind of take this portrait apart and find the objects that were displayed on it. So they wore these elaborate headpieces, headdresses. There used to be kingfishers in China, but all of that blue is kingfisher feathers, and the kingfisher is long since extinct.